The cold wind blew through the streets of Houston, Mississippi, as if it too felt the weight of the world pressing down on the shoulders of a young man named Larry Stewart. It was 1971, and Larry, just 23, had hit rock bottom. He wasn't lazy. He wasn't aimless. Life had simply turned its back on him. Abrupt job loss, dwindling savings, and now hunger gnawed at his stomach as much as despair gnawed at his soul. That morning, he had walked into the Dixie Diner, more out of habit than hope. He had nothing in his pockets, no coins to clink, not even $1 to crumple. Yet his pride hadn't yet crumbled. He sat down, ordered a modest breakfast, pretending he could pay for it, telling himself he'd figure it out somehow. Maybe they'd let him wash dishes. Maybe they'd just kick him out. But what happened next would plant a seed that would grow quietly, patiently, for years. The diner's owner, a man named Ted Horn, noticed the young man's nervousness. He saw the darting eyes, the uneasy hands, the silence between bites. And when it came time for the bill, Ted walked over, handed Larry a folded $20 bill, and whispered, "Son, I think you dropped this." Larry froze. It was a simple sentence, but inside those 6 words was a message of dignity, grace, and silent understanding. Ted wasn't giving charity. He was giving Larry a lifeline without bruising his pride. Larry walked out of that diner full, not just from eggs and toast, but from a strange new feeling. A flicker of light, a belief that maybe the world wasn't entirely cold. But this wasn't the beginning of success. Not yet. It was only the first step toward a quiet revolution that would one day sweep through city streets and strangers' lives, one $100 bill at a time. But for now, Larry Stewart was just a man on the edge, carrying a warmth in his heart that no one else could see. The late 1970s in Kansas City were dressed in gray. Gray skies, gray streets, and for Larry Stewart, gray days that seemed to blend one into the other. Though the memory of that warm $20 bill in the Dixie Diner lingered in his heart like a lantern in the dark, it didn't keep the storms away. Life was still testing him. In 1978, just weeks before Christmas, Larry lost his job. Again. The timing was cruel. As the holiday season rolled in, when families celebrated, lights glittered, and laughter poured from warm homes, Larry found himself alone, unemployed, and questioning whether he'd ever catch a break. He scraped by that winter, piecing together odd jobs and swallowing his pride more often than meals. But just when things began to look up, it happened again. In December 1979, right before the holidays, he was let go. 2 years in a row. To many, this would have been the final straw. But for Larry, something inside refused to surrender. Maybe it was the kindness he'd once been shown. Maybe it was the belief that dignity mattered even in desperation. Whatever it was, it stirred in him that winter. One day, bundled in a worn coat, Larry pulled into a drive-in restaurant for a modest meal. As he waited, he noticed a young car hop working in the biting wind. No gloves, no scarf. The chill clung to her skin. But she smiled, took orders, and hustled back and forth without complaint. Larry saw himself in her, or at least the version of himself who had walked into that Mississippi diner years ago. When she brought his food, he handed her a $20 bill. Her eyes widened, confused. "Are you sure?" she asked. "I am," he said simply. She didn't cry. Not immediately. She just stood there, her lips trembling more from emotion than the cold. Then she whispered, "Thank you," and walked away before her tears could betray her pride. Larry sat there for a moment, the engine humming softly beneath him, feeling something new, something powerful. That simple act, that $20 bill, it hadn't just warmed her fingers, it had warmed her soul, and his. And in that moment, a quiet vow was born. If life ever gave Larry Stewart another chance, if he could climb out of this pit and make something of himself, he wouldn't forget what it felt like to be on the edge, to be cold, unseen, and barely holding on. And if he ever had the means, he would give, not with conditions, not for recognition, but because kindness deserved to live in the world. The world didn't know it yet, but that moment in a parking lot, between a car hop and a man with barely enough to spare, would ignite a movement that would change thousands of lives in the years to come. For most people, success is loud. Shiny cars, big houses, business cards stacked with titles. But for Larry Stewart, success came quietly, like a sunrise over a storm-tossed sea. After years of struggle and setbacks, Larry finally caught his break in the world of business. First, it was cable television, then long-distance calling. They weren't glamorous industries, but they were booming. Larry, with a sharp mind and a tireless work ethic, rode the wave with purpose. He built connections, learned fast, and played the long game. By the mid-1980s, Larry Stewart wasn't scraping for coins anymore. He was a millionaire. But unlike many who rise from hardship and bury the memory of it, Larry held tightly to his past. He never forgot the car hop, the Dixie diner, the gut-wrenching holidays, the quiet humiliation of not having enough. Instead of bitterness, those memories became his compass. He didn't celebrate his wealth with extravagance. He celebrated it with compassion. And so, one December morning, no reporters, no cameras, no entourage, Larry walked the streets of Kansas City with a stack of crisp $100 bills folded neatly in his pocket. No name tag, no explanation, just kindness, quietly placed into trembling hands. He looked for faces that mirrored the one he used to see in the mirror. Tired mothers, lonely veterans, young workers in threadbare uniforms, people on the brink trying to hold on to a shred of dignity. Sometimes he'd simply walk up to someone in a grocery store or parking lot and press a bill into their hand with a soft, "Merry Christmas." Sometimes he'd see someone struggling with tears in their eyes, and he'd offer help before they could ask. There was no script, no agenda. Just a man giving hope where hope had started to disappear. And no one knew his name. Word began to spread through Kansas City. A secret Santa was roaming the streets, handing out $100 bills to strangers. Some thought it was a myth. Others had stories so moving, so raw, they couldn't be anything but true. One woman told of receiving a bill just hours after being evicted. Another said it paid for her child's medicine. For many, it wasn't even the money that broke them. It was the gesture, the reminder that they weren't invisible, that someone saw them. Year after year, Larry returned to the streets every December, always alone, always silent. He gave out thousands, then tens of thousands, always in the same quiet way. It wasn't just a ritual, it was a redemption, for the boy who once sat hungry in a diner, for the man who knew the ache of a lost job at Christmas, for the soul who believed that true wealth isn't measured in dollars, but in how you use them. Larry Stewart was building a legacy, one that no one could see. Not yet. The winters in Kansas City became more than just seasons. They became chapters in a quiet legend. By the early 1990s, whispers had turned into wide-eyed stories. In barbershops and diners, at churches and shelters, people spoke of a man with kind eyes who appeared from nowhere and left warmth behind in the form of a $100 bill. For some, it was just a story. For others, it was a miracle. Larry Stewart never spoke a word about his mission. Not to neighbors, not to business partners. His wealth was growing, but his fame never caught up to it, because he never wanted it to. Every December, he'd slip out of his office, wearing a coat just like any other passerby, and blend into the crowd. He visited bus stops, food pantries, sidewalks. He handed out crisp bills like snowflakes, watching as cold, hopeless faces melted into sobs, laughter, or stunned silence. He saw a young man sleeping under a bridge and slipped cash into his coat pocket without waking him. He walked into a battered women's shelter and gave each woman a moment of dignity. He once visited a nursing home where the elderly had long stopped expecting surprises and left them beaming like children on Christmas morning. The money always helped, but what stayed with people longer was the feeling. The moment someone said, "You matter," without needing anything in return. Larry never asked for names. He never gave his. And still, the streets began to remember. Taxi drivers would talk about spotting him. The Santa in plain clothes. Shelter volunteers waited for the man who changed lives in minutes. Clerks at convenience stores watched as strangers stood frozen, holding a $100 bill with trembling hands, looking around for the angel who had just vanished. He began taking road trips to other cities, slipping into the chaos and pain of disaster-stricken places. After the 9/11 attacks, he handed out thousands in New York, where grief hung heavier than smoke. After Hurricane Katrina, he traveled to Mississippi, giving hope where houses had fallen and dreams washed away. But no matter how far he went, he always returned to Kansas City. It was more than home. It was the place that had raised him, tested him, and taught him about mercy in a diner decades ago. Larry wasn't trying to change the world, just one person at a time. And he did. Because what he gave wasn't just money. He gave proof. Proof that kindness still walked the earth. Proof that strangers can show up when you need them most. Proof that sometimes angels wear business suits and blend into crowds. The streets remembered. But the world still didn't know his name. Not yet. By the time 2006 arrived, Larry Stewart had handed out more than $1 million. All in person, all in secret. For over 2 decades, he walked among the forgotten and the overlooked, sowing kindness like seeds on frozen soil, trusting that some would bloom, even if he never saw it. But time, like truth, always moves forward. That year, Larry received a diagnosis that would shake the ground beneath him. Esophageal cancer. The words hit hard. It wasn't just the pain or the treatments ahead. It was the looming reality that his time, his quiet mission, might be running out. For a moment, he considered continuing as he always had, remaining anonymous, letting the legend of Secret Santa remain faceless, shapeless, eternal. But something inside him shifted. He realized that the kindness he had carried in silence all these years might not survive him unless he passed it on. Not just the stories, the mission. So for the first time since that cold winter morning in 1979, Larry Stewart stepped into the light. He revealed himself as the man behind the mystery, the hand behind the hope. The reaction was instant and overwhelming. News outlets scrambled to tell the story. Kansas City was stunned. The entire nation leaned in, captivated by this humble businessman who had turned his success into a weapon of mercy. People watched, listened, and cried as he shared his journey, not to be praised, but to inspire. He told the story of the Dixie Diner and Ted Horn's quiet $20 that changed everything. He spoke of his darkest days and how the smallest acts of compassion gave him strength when he had none. And most importantly, he made a call, not for donations, not for attention, but for others to pick up the torch, to give quietly or boldly, to look for the forgotten and remind them they mattered. Larry knew the power of a single gesture. He had lived it. He had become it. And now, as he stood before the world, facing the last chapter of his own story, he was no longer anonymous, but somehow even more powerful. His unmasking wasn't about recognition. It was a final, selfless gift. a challenge, a legacy. In his final months, Larry began training others, selecting people with big hearts and quiet spirits to carry on the tradition. He gave them stacks of $100 bills and asked them not just to give, but to connect, to listen, to heal. These weren't replacements. They were echoes, ripples in the pond he had stirred with his first $20 bill. He knew he wouldn't live to see what became of them, but he believed. On January 12, 2007, the heart that had quietly carried so much warmth through the world fell silent. Larry Stewart was just 58 when he passed away, surrounded by loved ones, but embraced by a much larger family. Thousands of strangers who never knew his name until it was almost too late. The man who once stood cold and hungry in a Mississippi diner. The man who whispered "Merry Christmas" and disappeared into the crowd. The man who transformed a simple $100 bill into a spark of life. He was gone, but not really. Kansas City mourned, not just because a generous man had died, but because, in his kindness, they had seen themselves, or the version of themselves they hoped to be. The secret Santa who never wanted praise became a symbol across the country, a reminder of the extraordinary power of quiet giving. And his story didn't end there. The people he trained, those he mentored in his final months, began to walk his path. Every December, in cities big and small, they stepped onto sidewalks, into shelters, through bus stations, with stacks of $100 bills and hearts full of purpose. They didn't wear costumes, they didn't carry signs, but they carried something greater, his spirit. And the ripples kept growing. One man started handing out cash in food courts. A woman began buying groceries for struggling mothers. A retired firefighter drove from town to town with an envelope full of folded bills. They were teachers, veterans, college students, millionaires, clerks. Not all of them had much, but all of them gave. And in the faces of those they helped, you could still see it, that pause, that disbelief, that flicker of hope. The same reaction Larry had seen thousands of times before. It wasn't about the money. It never had been. It was about being seen, being remembered, being loved by someone who didn't even know your name. Today, every Christmas season, while malls fill with shoppers and lights twinkle from rooftops, somewhere, on some corner, a stranger will place a $100 bill into another's hand. No name, no story, just a gift. And maybe, just maybe, the giver once needed that same kind of gift themselves. Larry Stewart may be gone, but his mission moves on. In pockets and hands, in tears and smiles, in whispers of Merry Christmas from people who know what it means to hurt and what it means to heal. He never built a monument, but he built something stronger. He built a legacy stitched into the fabric of human decency. A soft, unstoppable reminder that kindness costs nothing to give, but it can change everything. And if you ever find yourself on a cold street, heart heavy and hands empty, don't be surprised if someone taps your shoulder, smiles, and says, "Looks like you dropped this,"